Welcome to another bit of speculative fun in the form of liminal biomes. Today we return to the Labyrinth Coast Expedition as our band of would-be explorers finally nears the ocean. Due to various factors, including a few unfolding plans, I am posting the latest liminal biome entry just a bit early. This will be the final entry for the Labyrinth Coast series. I hope it proves to be an enjoyable one. We continue onward into this waterlogged realm. My body feels remarkably light now with the lower gravity, that or the slight delirium drifting about the edges of my mind. It feels as though we hardly need to breathe at all at this point. That is worrisome. Today we saw what looked like one of the wolf scuttlebeasts caught out on its own. Perhaps the rest of its pack had been eaten. If so, it joined them. The thing that devoured it was a larger one of its ilk, not so much a wolf as perhaps a bear, or whatever answers for a bear in this twisted place. Happily enough, the thing seemed altogether uninterested in us. That is at least one small mercy. As we draw nearer to the shore, it seems as though fewer and fewer things find us at all appetizing. We are simply too small and perhaps too unfamiliar to be worth bothering over. I can only hope that we remain well beneath notice. The situation continues to deteriorate. There are troubling signs of low-level oxygen toxicity, though different expedition members are thus far affected to differing degrees. That said, it is only a matter of time before conditions become altogether debilitating. Oddly, the rising air pressure may conceal a second danger. There is the distinct possibility of nitrogen narcosis, though it is probable that oxygen toxicity will become significant well before this issue grows concerning. The presence of parasites has been confirmed within the Labyrinth Coast, at least by inference. One of the larger scuttlebeasts was observed engaged in a highly unusual behavior. The creature had climbed to the top of one of the smaller stone trees and was simply resting out in the open, its appendages slowly waving about. Its form appeared oddly bloated and listless, leaving its possible species altogether unrecognizable. It is likely that the creature was discolored as well, rendering proper identification all the more elusive. After several minutes of observation, the expedition had to withdraw. A Titan was approaching, and it has become standard policy to seek cover whenever this occurs. From a sheltered vantage point, it was possible to observe the bloated scuttlebeast being snapped up by the large predator. It offered no struggle and appeared almost eager to be devoured. Such is the grisly influence of what was most likely some form of internal parasite. Equivalent cases have been documented within mundane space, where a creature is manipulated to facilitate its own consumption, passing the parasite on to its next host. The labyrinth hardly feels like the same place now, despite the ongoing abundance of stone trees and bizarre monstrosities. At the outset, there was something almost charming about the place. Now, much of that charm has given way to a wary sense of otherworldliness. There have been odd changes in the vegetation. The greenery, such as it is, has been partially replaced with various rust-hued forms. Based on the samples taken, these seem to be a different form of algal life, likely more adapted to the different physical conditions. Perhaps they are dependent on high oxygen or high air pressure. In previously traveled regions, the creatures were all of similar sizes to one another. As we draw nearer to the shoreline, this uniformity has broken down. Now there seems to be a wide variety of forms and sizes hiding away from the various titans lurking at the labyrinth edges. Many of the local fauna now have the creeping venomous pattern of behavior. The frantic motion of the other regions has given way to an unsettling tranquility. What drifters still remain are remarkably furtive, never straying far out into the open sky, at least not for very long. At long last, we caught our first glimpses of the open sea, though it was more a series of channels between distinct islands. Soon we will either see our way to more open water, or else turn back out of sheer necessity. It can be confidently stated that the expedition has left the middle labyrinth and reached the far labyrinth. The region is dominated by remarkably large species, generally observed only at a distance, half concealed in the mist. There are a number of species that are dwarfed by these titans, though they are still considerably larger than the human scale. These forms of intermediate size almost universally exhibit a creeping modality and are adorned with venomous spines. The batrachian forms have largely given way to more serpentine morphologies, though perhaps vermiform would be more accurate as a description. There is also a growing abundance of smaller forms, though these appear to be different to the scuttlers encountered in the near labyrinth. After following the approximate coastline for several hours, we have reached what appears to be a vast expanse of open ground. It seems to be a mudflat of sorts, or whatever equivalent might exist in this realm. There are many pools of shallow water, and subtle ripple patterns suggest a regular inundation with high tides. It is impossible to guess at the size of this place, as any semblance of a horizon is altogether obscured by the heavy fog. There are a number of subtle signs of subterranean life here, such as clearly defined pores in the muddy surface or odd incongruities in the rippled patterning. There are even probable siphons that appear to be masquerading as a sparse alien flora. We haven't risked a venture out into this open ground, as it is highly probable that at least some of the unseen burrowers might easily regard us as potential food. This caution was soon justified when we observed a creeping scuttlebeast moving slowly along the edge of one of the rock formations. It was abruptly pulled beneath the mud, thrashing for only a moment before it was altogether lost from sight. We've been particularly fastidious about staying on stony ground since we saw this happen. As we made our way carefully along the edges of this foreboding expanse, we saw a titan slowly approaching through the mist. This creature was larger than any other thus far observed. As if to heighten the absurdity, the colossal monstrosity had a distinctly purple hue about it. Perhaps our senses of humor have become addled by the current atmosphere, but it was quickly named the Royal Behemoth, both for its size and its regal coloration. The Royal Behemoth appears to be a specialist adapted to live on the mudflats of the Labyrinth coast. Its size suggests the scale of these flats must be considerable. The creature moves relatively slowly, with a size that puts it quite out of reach of any of the subterranean predators. In fact, it appears that these would-be predators are prey for the creature. Its front appendages are adapted for digging, while its mouth conceals a long, extensible tongue. The creature feeds by locating prey beneath the mud, digging it up with surprising rapidity, and using its tongue to draw it up into its mouth. Subsequent crunching noises suggest a formidable array of crushing teeth concealed within this mouth, though none have volunteered to verify this by direct observation. One mysterious aspect to the creature is the abundance of relatively small wavering tentacles on its back. These might be sensory organs or defensive structures of some sort. Alternatively, they may be some form of smaller commensal organism using the creature's back as a habitat. They might even be offspring in some early dependent stage. At last, we've gone as far as we could, finding our way out onto a rocky peninsula. Beyond, we could see a few scattered rock formations. Beyond those, only the ocean and the mist, a roiling expanse of shifting clouds. It seems that this ocean is a curious mixture of air and saltwater with a thriving population of phytoplankton. This might at least partially explain the ridiculously high oxygen concentration. From this promontory, the few stony cliffs we could see were adorned with especially rugged forms of rust-hued growth. There was a steady onshore wind, and so it looked almost as though we were falling into the clouds as the dense fog washed over us. It felt as if we were gazing into another world, and many of us suspect this place could well be near to the opposite boundary. If so, we haven't traveled to the halfway point, as is normally the case in liminal biomes. Rather, we have traversed the biome in its entirety, standing now on the threshold of the far reality. If this is indeed the case, then this other reality is far more compatible with our physiology than almost any other thus far described. As we stood, staring into the hazy abyss, we noticed the cloud formations beginning to move more rapidly. Chaotic whorls and eddies appeared, and the filtered daylight quickly began to dim. A storm was approaching, and we were caught with nowhere to flee to. Thus we hunkered down as best we could, pressing ourselves close into the irregular rock formations and tying ourselves down with what rope we'd brought. Somewhat to our relief, what happened next was not a tempest. The clouds were not being disturbed by an oncoming storm, but rather by an approaching monstrosity. It was a creature of such surpassing size it was more like a geological feature than an animal. A vast titan the size of a mountain hauled itself up onto one of the isolated rock formations. We could only watch as it lingered there, letting out a low, resonant bellow that shook reality itself. Then curious wisps of what looked like rose-hued vapor began to rise from its back. This apparent mist proved to be innumerable particles carried aloft in the strong wind. We watched as the trailing streaks sailed overhead, borne inland at remarkable speed. This lasted for only a minute or two. The bizarre emission slowly lessened before ceasing altogether. Then, as quickly as the creature had appeared, it turned and vanished once more into the clouded abyss. We have named it the Leviathan, though our focus has been more centered on what it might have spawned. Since departing the furthest promontory, we've moved inland as quickly as we dare. As of tonight, we are nearing the bounds of the middle labyrinth. It would seem that the current conception of the Labyrinth Coast ecosystem is in need of some degree of revision. There is little doubt among the expedition members that the Leviathan behavior observed was some form of spawning. The potential implications of this are considerable. Currently, it is the first priority of the expedition to return to the near labyrinth with as much speed as is safely feasible. To that end, the usual observation protocols have been suspended until further notice. It has been quite the forced march today. In just a single day we've traversed the middle labyrinth and are at the edges of the near labyrinth. The place is much as we remember, apart from one single significant difference. There is an abundance of small, frantic creatures the size of large insects. Each has a familiar, vaguely rosy hue about it. Beyond this, their forms are surprisingly variable, with differing numbers of limbs and styles of movement. More interestingly, this abundance is rapidly diminishing. Virtually everything else is eating these diminutive things with considerable enthusiasm. Those that survive this predation are without exception moving hastily inland. The current theory is that these tiny creatures will be more or less safe just at the threshold of our reality. In that place, the gravity is so high and the oxygen so low that the larger creatures simply cannot function well enough to pose much of a threat. From there, as they grow, these little creatures will slowly move back towards the ocean. Along the way, they will occupy regions balanced between predation pressure on the one hand and abiotic factors on the other. Too far inland, and the physical conditions of their surroundings interfere with their physiology. Too far seaward, and they are surrounded by predators considerably larger than themselves. This probable scenario gives rise to an inevitable question. How many of the described species on this expedition are actual species, and how many are simply larval or juvenile stages of much larger creatures? As the expedition draws to a close, at the threshold where it began, there is a noteworthy change in the environment. A renewed abundance of tiny scuttling forms. The diminutive creatures are feeding ravenously on the local vegetation and anything else they can find. This includes each other. A few have already been observed molting into larger creatures with forms remarkably different to those of their predecessors. Several of these new arrivals have been captured and preserved for genetic analysis. The wealth of samples collected over the course of the expedition will be studied closely for quite some time before any final conclusions are reached. It is good to be back home. It is perhaps even better to feel dryness on my skin. We were all in pretty rough shape by the end of that expedition. Even Charlotte, despite her adventurous personality, seemed altogether ready to be done with the place. Still, it has been most interesting to read the correspondence from our colleagues. It would appear that roughly 70% of the animal samples we collected proved to come from only 5 distinct genetic species. Of these, a full third are from the Leviathan species, matched to the creatures collected at the end of the expedition. It would seem that the Labyrinth Coast is, more than anything else, a sort of nursery for some of the larger fauna of the adjoining reality. At the very least, this much has been verified for the Leviathan. Interestingly enough, there has been some talk of renaming the Leviathan. The common name of Echidna has been suggested, as it seems to be a mother to myriad forms of monster. I shall leave that to the self-proclaimed experts in such matters. Another amusing piece of proposed nomenclature concerns the realm itself. It will likely retain the name of the Labyrinth Coast for the immediate future at least. However, the dimension it adjoins at its far end has been given the tentative name of Niflheim. This is derived from one of the realms described in Norse mythology, sometimes said to be a primal sort of place veiled in mist and teeming with monsters. Not a bad fit as names go. Still, the final decision on such matters doesn't rest with me. In the end, I was merely a part of the expedition, along for the ride, as it were. That said, I can't really complain. I've been well paid and gained a number of useful acquaintances and connections within the field of liminal biome exploration. This is just as well, as I will most likely be compelled to go on another expedition before too much time has passed. Charlotte is resting for the time being and quite content to relax about the house. However, if I know her even half as well as I suspect, it will take only a month or two for that serenity to fade away. Then we will be off on another venture of one sort or another into the next liminal realm in search of suitable distraction. I can only hope that wherever we travel to, it might be somewhat less taxing than the Labyrinth Coast expedition proved to be.